Everyone, this is Jason Profetto. This is my HSED706 assignment number 2. So it's going to be a case presentation for the Leadership and Management course. It's a little bit embarrassing, but this is actually the first time I've ever done QuickTime. So I hope this goes well, and I hope you can see and hear everything that I'm trying to do. As I said, my name is Jason Profetto. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a case, and I want to go over some of the orientation around the case, because I'm going to be providing a lot of details that it'll definitely be sufficient in that sense, but the specifics as to who and what happened, I'm going to be a little bit careful with names and pronouns, as there was a little bit of this was more of a describing a conflict and a difficult situation that I had that didn't necessarily have a great outcome. So I'm going to be referring to an undergraduate medical leadership position, specifically at the medical school, McMaster. And this is work that I was doing in parallel with colleagues, as well as underneath a specific supervisor who was holding the role of director at the time. So just to orient, this was a department where there was a director, and this is position A or person A, and they oversaw two parts of the curriculum beneath them. So there was the pre-clerkship and the clerkship, and each of these actually had their own director. So I was in position B, which was the pre-clerkship director, and there was also a position C, which was the clerkship director. So A oversaw B and C were working in parallel, and I was B. What my specific position entailed was overseeing, developing, and working around a lot of the curriculum in this particular department in the pre-clerkship. So this meant that I had to engage and work with other stakeholders or other medical educators in leadership positions that were also doing things that were related to my area. Everything I did, so I worked in parallel with a lot of different colleagues, but in the end, everything I did had to be reported to the director, which, if you recall, was position A or person A. Now, the complicating factor, and this is interesting because my director in this particular role was also somebody who, in a different department of the undergraduate medical education, they and I worked in parallel with one another in different roles. So at that point, I was not actually responsible to report to this individual. We were working in tandem, in parallel, and we were doing things collaboratively in that sense. And all of these roles were medical education related, but really just in different departments. So the situation was that as the pre-clerkship director in this specific department, I was coming up with a bunch of different initiatives that I thought would really advance this department in this area and what was currently being done and what the future was. And the three main things I was working on was a medical education-based conference for the department, a faculty development event, and then an elective opportunity for students to do, which was really a type of enhancement program. The details of what these are and what I specifically was doing isn't as important, but a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of enthusiasm really went into this. The situation continued. So I worked on these initiatives, and what happened was I came forward with a first iteration, a straw dog, and I created a proposal and I brought it to the necessary stakeholders. So these were individuals who were in a position to give me feedback, were also doing things that were related to these projects, and they did just that. So they provided me feedback and they provided me some commentary, which I took into consideration. I also had engaged multiple other individuals outside of the actual department, and I was looking for feedback and just want to engage in a bit of discussion just to get a sense of what people thought and what people would be interested in. And it was, and this is what these references refer to as well. I'm not going to get too deep into like leadership theory, and just for the sake of time and telling the story, but when I sought out ideas and discussion from other individuals that I thought would be interested in what I had to present and what I had to, the direction I wanted to do. Like, this was that very first part of engaging a change. I was looking at the individuals that would be interested. I was trying to promote and introduce an idea, let it percolate, and let individuals give me feedback on this. After some work, I had done some editing, and I came forward with, like, a second iteration or an updated proposal, and I brought this back to the stakeholders that had initially gave me feedback. So I had done a lot of work, I got some feedback, I made some changes, and I came back. And really, when I came back and presented it again, I actually received a lot of praise and positive commentary on the work that I had done. And in fact, there was some constructive suggestions, but there was a lot of positive feedback, and the vibe was actually quite good. So as a result, I felt quite good about the work. And again, some of these references actually refer to principles and tenets around motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. And I put them there because I used it to just guide my reflection as I was creating this presentation. And the bottom line is I was doing a lot of work on this. And it's interesting to think about, in retrospect, where the motivation had come and what the role was of positive feedback mixing with and affecting or influencing my intrinsic feedback. So the director, after a bunch of proposals and getting feedback from the necessary stakeholders, the director asked to meet with me. The individual asked to meet with me in such a way that I got the sense that something may have been up, only because it was a quick and relatively curt email that was sent to me asking to meet on a relatively urgent basis, and I couldn't really think of what other reasons there was. It was a closed-door meeting. It was just the director and myself, and there was no one else in the room. And they advised me that they wanted to provide some feedback on this work that I had been doing in my pre-clerkship director role. And essentially what they advised me is that they had spoken to other individuals that had been providing me feedback and getting some comments and thoughts from them on my work and my proposal. And so I say this is where the tree fell, because this is the point where there was a moment where I was in a leadership position, but also as a follower or an individual that was reporting to another medical education leader. And I think this is where it all went wrong. So the director advised me, and I actually wrote these things down because I was quite surprised at the feedback I had received. So the director advised me verbatim the following feedback. The first thing they said was that my work has caused significant damage in the department. They used the word damage, significant damage. The second thing was that they, or the director, had been doing a lot of nonstop damage control as a result of the work that I had been doing because of the damage it was causing, and that I had really bothered several pretty important people high up in the department because of the work I'd been doing. And I actually found this quite confusing, and it really seemed incongruent and inconsistent with what I had done to date. So I asked for clarifications to what I did specifically, just to clarify exactly where this was coming from. And I remember sitting in this meeting just thinking how bizarre this was, given the fact that I had done so much work and what I thought was engaging the appropriate people and having some progressive discussion. So when I asked for some clarification, the director advised me that some of the important people high up felt that I wasn't actually listening to their feedback, and I was coming back with proposals that did not reflect this. And the thing is that this is not consistent with what my feedback experience was. The second thing the director says that I engaged other people that weren't in the department about my ideas, and they really felt that this was unwise and like just a major error, tactical error in how to make a project move forward that's related to a specific department. And then there was this idea of usurping, that I was overstepping my boundaries in my leadership position. And there's a little bit of I don't know if the turf war is the right word, but I was overstepping my boundaries and doing things that I probably shouldn't have done with this work, and starting to make some high level decisions without the appropriate permission. And it came back as very forward and relatively negative. feedback. So I honestly felt like this feedback hurt, and I tried to reflect on the emotion that I would apply to it. And if I actually sit and think about it, I would actually say the feedback hurt, especially given the fact that I had done a lot of work. And this was a little bit earlier in my career, so I don't know if this was just an immaturity or a thin skin thing or what, but that's how I felt at the time. And when I reflected, I was very bothered by the actual nature of the meeting. The fact that it was closed door, it was a little bit curtain in the invitation and the specific feedback that I was provided. And I took much of this quite personally, I felt at that time. And I felt the feedback was unnecessarily damaging and destructive in nature. And again, these citations are related to resources at the end of the presentation, but I reflected on for example, like the four frames model of leadership and thinking about the symbolic and the political and the human resources frames as they pertain to leadership and the different parts of those that went wrong or I felt went wrong and perhaps could have been done better in this situation, right? And even in you think about the human resources and understanding the actual the organization as a collection of humans and we're working and we need to feel like we're doing something that means something, and autonomy and independence and praise and all these other tenets that are very important. And so I thought a lot of this was damaging and destructive. And as it pertains as it pertains to motivation and extrinsic factors and influences, how that affected me and my view at the time was quite negative. And at that point, I was thinking about what to do. So I had a situation where I was doing all of this work. I received very negative and destructive, what I thought, feedback at the time, and it really bothered me, especially the way it came out. And words like damage and destruction and damage control, I thought were unnecessarily personal. So my thoughts at the point was, like, do I take this feedback, even if it's negative, and try to move forward in a positive and productive way? Or do I say thank you, but no thank you, and maybe resign and move on to something different? Or perhaps should I think just a little bit further and have I perhaps even misinterpreted something, and could further discussion and clarification help? So these were the different types of ideas that I was trying to decide between. What I ended up doing, my actions were, I called an individual close to me and an advisor of sorts, and to be honest, it was my mom, just because I trust my mom with a lot of professional and academic and medical advice, because she's been in the medical profession as well. And so we did a bit of a debrief, and she provided me some advice, and we had a bit of dialogue too, which was extremely helpful. And I took time to think about the situation and just really reflect on what happened and how I felt, and to let things just percolate a little bit before making a knee jerk reaction and doing something too reflexively. And I reached out as well to the director, the individual that provided me with the negative feedback, and I thought, it might be good to debrief about the situation and what happened, and were these indeed accurate pieces of feedback for me? So my confidant, my mom, provided me with some good advice, and she actually urged me to stick with the position and try to work it out and persevere and move forward. And the more I reflected, the more I really felt that there was some sort of, and I was talking about the four frames model of leadership, and I really felt that in now looking back, but also at the time, there was multiple fundamental pieces of what leadership should look like, what communication and interpersonal etiquette how it should function, and I thought a lot of this was breached and it was broken down. And then lastly, and perhaps most disappointingly to me, was that the director actually ignored my attempts to reach out to them. So what I ended up doing was I stepped down from the position, I resigned, and I sent a letter to the chair of the department and the director, and I advised them that I just felt really uncomfortable doing all this work and being treated like this with these words and not having a chance to debrief about it after. And whether or not this was right or wrong, it's what I did and what I felt was the most important. And it's interesting because if you look, down the road, so this was about 5 years ago. If you look to the present day, the director, so that person A or position A is actually no longer in the director position, and I'm not sure exactly why, but I get the sense that there was further issues beyond what happened with me, and I think that's kind of a somewhat common story you tend to hear. And the former director is actually no longer in the department in any leadership role anymore. So you wonder about what happened after, or how much my situation in particular, where a leader in the department steps down because of an interpersonal conflict. And person C, so if you remember, that was the actual clerkship director, reached out to me and expressed some concerns about what happened years ago. So we had a bit of a debrief, a very delayed debrief about what happened and what we could have done better, or what could have changed. And it was interesting because the touching base helped, but I almost felt it would have been a bit more helpful if it was earlier on or closer to the actual date of the scenario. And I learned quite a bit in this situation. I think there's a balance between trying to persevere through something that's difficult and drawing a line between what's tolerable and not tolerable. And again, I don't know if what I did was right or wrong in the end, or if it was the best scenario, the best outcome. But there is this balance and this constant sort of homeostatic equation between perseverance and tolerance of a difficult situation. I think there is such thing as abuse, and not all feedback is necessarily good feedback. I think if feedback is overly personal, overly negative, and it can have a very destructive tone to it, it may not be helpful, and it can cross the line and turn into some form of abuse or harassment. And when you start to talk about autonomy and giving individuals some space and opportunity, there's a lot of complexities to that term, autonomy, and there's nuances that need to be unpacked a little bit further, especially as it pertains to a leadership role, and also how other leaders relate to this leader, and what responsibility, accountability, and reporting actually looks like, and how it's operationalized. Hindsight's always 20/20, right? So it's obviously a lot easier to look back and think about what was right or wrong. But when you're in a situation, and this is interesting because it starts to relate to the week that we spent on talking about planning, where there's very simple, where A leads to B, and we know exactly what happens in between. It's very predictable, and it's considered best practice. But then there's convoluted, and there's complex, and then there's chaotic, where things can happen, but it's difficult to know ahead of time necessarily what happens in between, or if you're even going to come to some expected outcome, which would be more like chaotic. And of course, in between all these different areas of planning is this concept of disorder. And when you're in a scenario where you're really not sure what is right and what is wrong, it's tough to really sort out what to expect and how to plan the best you can. And to a certain extent, you can only plan certain parameters so much in so much detail. You know, trusting your gut is also an interesting idea. How much do you trust what you feel? How reliable is that? And there's some interesting literature, like even Fast and Slow Thinking, or the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, that sort of explores this idea of first impressions and instincts and how powerful and accurate they can be. And then in the end, I don't think there's always necessarily a perfect solution to difficult situations in leadership positions. So, I put the end question mark only because who knows what the end of this situation actually is, and sometimes there can be a bit of a legacy effect, and something might happen in 5 or 10 years as a result of the details of this situation. So I'm going to end there just in the interest of time, and here are some of my references. I just make a highlight of reference number 6, which is Dale Carnegie's book on how to win friends and influence people. It's a very old book, and it's had multiple iterations, but there's a lot of interesting topics in that book about rules of engagement and interpersonal relation, and even starts to relate to what we currently know as emotional intelligence, and the last 2 pillars, which is social awareness and social management. So I hope I did this properly and adequately, and it was of interest to the individuals watching this, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions. And on that, I think I am done my presentation.